Mm. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for attending today. Today is the fourth in our series of the Act of Hope series. Today is focused on environmental racism, and we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who joins us from McMaster University. I will introduce Ingrid here shortly, but I want to go through land acknowledgement and framing as usual. And before I start the land acknowledgement, I just want to let folks know on the call that I always check the evaluation data from our survey. And occasionally we'll get a little comment in there that'll say like, take less time to do the land acknowledgement. And I just wanted to address that before we get started and let you know that our land acknowledgement has been crafted by our Decolonizing and Indigenizing Committee. So this is a bit of work that's been done over a period of a year with Mi'kmaq and Indigenous social workers who are connected to you here at the college. And I'd offer, all right, because I invite you to consider if you find the land acknowledgement a little too long, think about that a little bit. Consider what is it about the land acknowledgement that maybe is uncomfortable for you or that you dislike. And I just want to encourage folks to consider that, a 7 to 10 minute land acknowledgement can be long, absolutely, for an hour-long session. And in comparison to 500 years of colonial oppression, it's a small thing. And it can impact people. And I understand that some people would prefer that it was shorter. So I just want to invite you to be curious about your own thoughts around this. And not to say that our approach is the right one, but it is guided by the work and the contributions of our Mi'kmaq and Indigenous colleagues, and I want to honor their work and their contributions. As part of our commitment to truth and reconciliation and Indigenous resistance and resurgence. So with that in mind, I do want to begin by acknowledging that here at the college, we are located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I'm currently in Chibuktuk, sorry, that's where our offices are located, colonially known as Halifax. I'm very privileged to live over in Punamukutijik, which is the Dartmouth side of the harbor. It's important to acknowledge that the inherent rights of the Mi'kmaq were recognized in the Peace and Friendship Treaty signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. Canada later reaffirmed the treaties in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, and they remain active to this day. So as we consider our land acknowledgement and this content of today around environmental racism and active hope and addressing the climate emergency, it can be helpful to take a position as a social worker, as an individual, that sees ourselves as an expression of nature. So there's a quote at the bottom that I often reference here from Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, a really great resource. This is from the Radical Tenderness cards. And it says, understand that the earth is not an extension of our bodies, it's the other way around. So what might be possible from a decolonial lens or a lens grounded in social justice or relationality if we see ourselves as expressions of nature, as extensions of Mother Earth? And how might that inform our work around decolonization and support for Indigenous resurgence and resistance? Let us take a moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in sacred work. I'm thinking of land defenders and water protectors engaged in resistance and resurgence here in Mi'kmaq, across Turtle Island, and around the world. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere inside and out. So hopeful that today's session around environmental racism, around addressing climate emergency, leads us to be in a right relationship with this land, with one another. And with that, it's also a reminder that we are treaty people. And so, especially for the settler Canadians who might be on this call, like myself, what are our rights and responsibilities to uphold treaty rights for our Indigenous and Mi'kmaq colleagues and community members? How does this work or impact the work that we do and how we do it? How will it guide our work together today and going forward? Here at the college, we're also really committed as well to translating, I guess, the words into action. So it's not enough to do a land acknowledgement. It's not enough to, make a notice about reparations. We also have to be working to shifting the material conditions for ourselves and for others. And so as we use land acknowledgements, it's also tied to our work around revising the code of ethics or supporting the work of our Indigenous colleagues. It's also important to discuss and and be distinct and separate from the land acknowledgement, but to discuss and invite some reflections around our commitment to reparations for people of African descent. While settler colonialism and the forces that led to the enslavement and displacement of people of African descent are not the same, they are entangled. So the college firmly recognizes that reparations are both a moral and material obligation to atone for the deep-rooted history of anti-Black racism within Nova Scotia in the broader Canadian context, which has led to human rights violations and crimes committed against people of African descent. For us here at the college, when we think about our commitment to reparations, we're really thinking about these 5 areas: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and then guarantees of non-repetition. So ensuring that this doesn't happen again, that we're not further perpetuating the crimes that have led to the displacement and enslavement of people of African descent and the ongoing oppression that exists in today. So also as well, you might want to look at this link for the Emancipation Day in Canada, reflecting on the legacy and pursuing reparations. I will post a link to this presentation in the chat. There's more content on our website that speaks to our commitment, but I want to ground our commitment to reparations in the history of people of African descent, and noting that in Nova Scotia, the history of people of African descent is marked by resilience, contribution, and a profound influence on the province's social fabric. So we have 52 distinct African Nova Scotian communities across this province, and we have connections to the Black Loyalists, the Maroons, and Southern American Black refugees, and the legacies of these communities have delicately shaped Nova Scotia's cultural landscape. Their stories, marked by perseverance in the face of adversity, are central to our shared history and necessitate both recognition and institution. So as we're thinking about environmental racism, let's ground ourselves in Mi'kmaq ways of knowing and being, and also ground ourselves in the importance of reparations and restitution for people of African descent. So again, it's important at the college that we also take a stand, that we're resisting the idea of neutrality or objectivity, and understand that our work is political. I almost cringe saying that word, given that the election was last night and we're still waiting for more information to come out of that. But the personal is political, and the work that we do is connected to multiple systems, and how we use our values and our principles and how we apply them in an embodied way really matters. And so it's important that we take a stand and that we resist neutrality. So I'm going to post some questions here in the chat, and I'd love to hear from people how you're arriving. Who's here today? We currently have 27 people on the call. We have about 68 registered, so we might have about 30 or 40 people to show up. I'd love to know who's in the room. So in the chat, I'm just putting in the prompts here. Who are you? How are you arriving? What is your practice area? What motivated you to attend today's session? And anything else that you'd like to share that will help ground you into this session. So I'm going to continue on with the framing and just more welcoming to the session. But please engage in the chat and let us know who you are. So the agenda today, once I get through the framing and the check-in, I'll be passing over to Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who will be going through a presentation on the history of violence, the legacy of environmental racism in Canada. We'll also have time for some small group discussions and sharebacks later in the session. We are scheduled to go to 1:30. I recognize that some folks on this call might only be able to stay till 1 o'clock. I understand. And just a reminder, this is being recorded, so we will have access to this presentation on our YouTube at a later date. Some framing for our time together is it can be helpful to keep these in mind as we engage in the session. Your engagement with this session may not have immediate and or practical applications for you, and that's okay. You don't have to agree with anything presented or shared, but we ask that you be open to seeing what happens. You take responsibility for yourself by observing and learning from your conscious and unconscious responses. It's up to you to decide how much you want to share and participate, and a reminder that we can all engage in ways that support others. So how we spend our time together can also be contributing to social justice. It can be contributing to a sense of resistance to consumerism, capitalistic mindsets that say when we engage in content like this, it's going to immediately line up with our expectations, or we're going to have some sort of tangible benefit. That may happen for many of you on the call, and for some of you, it might take some time to process and reflect before the learning sort of integrate and become present. So objectives for today, these are also on the Eventbrite, but really what we're hoping is that we're going to be developing some knowledge and skills around environmental racism, and also shifting some values around this concept and around the climate emergency and how it relates to our role as social workers. A reminder as well for PD tracking for members on the call, you can claim this as form of professional development. It can also be claimed for the anti-racism and anti-discriminatory practices under our mandated topics if you so choose. And then, of course, this is connected to our code of ethics. And I want to guide you to thinking about value 2, promoting social justice, and in particular, principle that states social workers advocate for the stewardship of natural resources and the protection of the environment for the common good of all people. It's also helpful to consider that, as social workers, we want to promote for the protection of the environment, the land, air, water, plants, and animals. We want to be able to identify how climate change exacerbates social inequalities. We want to better understand environmental racism and how disproportionately and negatively impacts marginalized and oppressed communities. We also want to be able to acknowledge the rights of Indigenous peoples and their rights to steward their own lands. This session today is also aligned with value 1, respecting the dignity and worth of all people, and also value 3, pursuing truth and reconciliation. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Ingrid Waldron here in a second, but first I want to read out her bio and give you a little bit of a sense of who she is if you're not familiar with her work. Dr. Ingrid Waldron is Professor and Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University. She's the leading scholar, researcher, and voice on environmental racism in Canada. She co-developed with former Liberal MP Lenore Zahn a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice, Bill C-226, the first federal private members bill, which became Canada's first environmental justice law / legislation on June 20th, 2024. Her scholarship and advocacy also focus on climate justice in Black and other racialized communities, mental illness and dementia in Black communities, and COVID-19 in Black and South Asian communities. Ingrid is the author of the book, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which was turned into a 2020 Netflix documentary of the same name and is co-produced by Waldron, hometown hero, actor Elliot Page, and also Ian Daniel. Ingrid is the founder and director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, and Dr. Waldron's book entitled From the Enlightenment to Black Lives Matters, The Impact of Racial Trauma on Mental Health in Black Communities was published on November 25th, 2024. I invite you folks to help me in recognizing Dr. Ingrid Waldron, and so grateful for you to be here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you have access to doing that. Yeah, and just so happy that you're here with us today, and you're here with us for our 4th session on Active Hope. And I think this is a timely session given the political climate of the right now and the challenges of climate injustice that are facing many people. And here in Mi'kmaq in particular, as we go into another hurricane season, how might environmental racism be impacting people today, tomorrow, and in the future? So Ingrid, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Can you see my slides?
And it's on, there we go. Yeah, it's on the view now. That's a slideshow.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As was mentioned, I will be doing a presentation on environmental racism, looking specifically at a bit of the journey I've taken over the past few years to address the issue, starting when I was in Nova Scotia. I'm going to provide a few case studies of environmental racism across the country. I'm going to discuss how I've been trying to address it. And at the end, I'm going to discuss some of the things that you may consider as social workers and how to get involved in this topic. But I want to begin with a quote. This quote comes from a resident of Lincolnville back in 2013, when I first visited that community to hear their concerns about a first and second generation landfill that was placed there by the municipality. So this person says, if you look at the health of the community prior to 1974, before the landfill site was located in our community seemed to be healthier. From 1974 on until the present day, we noticed our people's health seems to be going downhill. Our people seem to be passing on at a younger age. They are contracting different types of cancers that we never heard of prior to 1974. Our stomach cancer seems to be on the rise, diabetes on the rise. Our people end up with tumors in their body, and we're at a loss of what's causing it. The municipality says that there's no way that the landfill site is affecting us. But if the landfill site located in other areas is having an impact on people's health, then shouldn't the landfill site located next to our community be having an impact on our health too? So here you see James Desmond. James Desmond is an African Nova Scotian former resident of Lincolnville. And I say former because unfortunately he passed away 2 years ago, but gave much of his life to addressing environmental racism in Lincolnville. And when we met with the community in 2013, that was September 2013, we were also filming a documentary that was called In Whose Backyard, which you can find on the Enrich website. And we asked him to define environmental racism, because when I had begun the project in Nova Scotia, a lot of people didn't understand the term environmental racism. So I wanted him to kind of break it down. So he says the following. He says the practice, so this is how he defines environmental racism. The practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African, Nova Scotian, Native, and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism? It's environmental racism to its core. And here's the more academic definition of environmental racism, but very much aligns with what James Desmond just said about, certain racial groups being targeted. And when he says that these are groups that don't have a base to fight back, he's talking about the issue of power. So you'll see in this more academic definition that it reflects very much what James mentions in that quote. This more academic definition comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who is an African American who's currently teaching at a university in Texas, and he is considered to be the father of environmental justice. He says environmental racism is racial discrimination in the greater or disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities. He says it's also about the lack of political power. So this is what James said when he said that these are communities that don't have a base to fight back. Robert Bullard here is talking about the lack of political power, but I would add to that social and economic power and clout, in addition to political power and clout. So in the lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters in their communities. Environmental racism is also racism in the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening presence of poisons in these communities. In other words, it's about policy, and it's specifically about environmental policy. So we have to look at the environmental policies that are made by departments of environment across Canada, to look at the kinds of policies that they're handing down and the decision-making that they're handing down that often leads to the placement of these hazardous sites, specifically in Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities. Environmental racism is also racism in the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup of environmental contamination in these communities. In other words, we have to ask, why does it take decades? In the case of Pictou Landing First Nation, over 50 years for something to happen, for the communities to get redress, for the government to do something about it. So the kind of delay in addressing this issue is another aspect of environmental racism. And finally, environmental racism is about who gets to have a seat at the table. So the very communities that are impacted by environmental racism, Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia, African Nova Scotian communities, are the communities that don't have a seat at the table. They're not invited to the table. So when we look at, when we look at environmental NGOs, other NGOs, different commissions and boards, when we look at who's on those groups, they're not the communities, typically they're not the communities that are most impacted. So that's when we have to ask, why are we excluding the very voices who should have a role to play in decision-making about their own communities? So as I said earlier, I wanted to provide you with just a few case studies of environmental racism across Canada. And I wanted to begin with Sabaganagati First Nation in Nova Scotia. I started my work on this topic in 2012 in Nova Scotia, so I thought it was fitting to start there. And Sabaganagati First Nation, if you remember, there was a lot of media coverage on this community back in the day. Starting in 2014, Alton Gas wanted to build a brine discharge pipeline near to the Shubenacadie River. And starting in 2014, this community started to engage in different forms of civil disobedience. They used their social media effectively to engage the broader community to help them engage in that resistance. And then finally in 2021, Alton Gas closed up shop and had halted the project after 7 years of various forms of resistance activities by this community. So this is one community that was really successful in getting this very dangerous brine discharge project to be halted. And the reason why they were concerned about this project is because there's literature in the United States specifically indicating that brine discharge pipelines can potentially be hazardous to one's health. And the community was concerned about their health. They were also concerned about the impact of this brine discharge pipeline on fish, on climate change, and just on community well-being. Here we have Boat Harbor. Boat Harbor is in Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia. And before 1967, Pictou Landing was a pristine hunting and fishing ground for the Indigenous people. But then in 1967, a mill started dumping effluent into Boat Harbor. And ever since then, it became a toxic cocktail of different types of pollutants. And the community started to resist, probably most notably in the 1980s. And the government made many broken promises to this community. The community would say that high rates of cancer, high rates of respiratory illnesses and other illnesses is tied to Boat Harbor. You may remember that back in 2019, the week of Christmas, the government made an announcement that they could no longer make broken promises to this community and that the mill had to stop. The mill had to halt its operations. And that did happen at the end of January 2020. Now we move to Ontario and Amjinwang First Nation. Many of you may have heard of this case. I would say, along with Pictou Landing First Nation, this is worst case scenario of environmental racism. This is an Indigenous community that is currently surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities, which is quite stunning. Similar to other communities, they would say high rates of cancer, respiratory illness, reproductive health issues such as reproductive cancers, birth anomalies, out of whack or abnormal birth rate ratios with more female to male births. That's out of whack. That's abnormal when we consider the Canadian average. They would say that these illnesses, these problems are linked to these facilities. Then we have Grassy Narrows First Nation near to Kenora, Ontario. In the 1960s and 1970s, mercury was dumped into the Wabigoon English River. And that's mercury, that's pretty dangerous. In 2015, there was cleanup, however. The government provided over, multi-million-dollar project to clean up this site. So it was cleaned up. However, in 2022, there was a CBC article with residents talking about the enduring health impacts of the mercury contamination that happened back in the 1960s and 1970s. They talked about community members dealing with cognitive delays, neurological issues, numbness in their fingers and toes, etc. Right? So I often say that even though there's cleanup sometimes on behalf of the government, we have to think about the health effects that often endure and remain in the community. And this is one such case. We move to Wet'suwet'en First Nation, Wet'suwet'en First Nation in northern BC. So over the last several years, there have been mass demonstrations sit-ins and blockades that have gripped parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposed to a multi-billion-dollar pipeline project near to their community in northern British Columbia. Now, environmental racism also impacts Black communities, most notably in Nova Scotia. It impacts African Nova Scotian communities. And one reason I think that's the case, I think that we see more examples of environmental racism among Black people in Nova Scotia than in any other province is because, as Tyler mentioned, we have over 50 African Nova Scotian communities, and 98% of them are rural communities rather than urban communities. And when we think of environmental racism, in addition to race being an issue as social class, all these things intersect to increase the likelihood that government will place it in these communities. We also have to think of geography, right? So Africville was one of very few urban African Nova Scotian communities, but in general, when we think of Nova Scotia, we think of African Nova Scotians, they're living in rural environments, and it's much easier to place a hazardous industry in rural communities when you think nobody's watching, right? You think nobody cares about these communities. Rural communities are often not thought about. So I often say that I think it's and then these communities are seen as less powerful, not only because they're Black, not only because they're low income, have lower education, but also because they live in isolated and out of the way places, once again, that nobody's thinking about. Africville was an urban community in Halifax, of course, but so the community in Africville was dealing with two things, I would say, simultaneously. They were dealing with gentrification, right? So in the 60s, the city of Halifax came in to do industrial development in this community, and they needed the community out. So the community was pushed out. The community went to other places like the north end of Halifax, specifically Uniacke Square. They also went to Montreal and other areas. So they were pushed out. But in the wake of industrial development, there were many environmental and social hazards that were left in the community. And this is why I say, in addition to gentrification, Africville is a symbol of environmental racism. In the wake of industrial development, these are the environmental hazards that were left in the community: a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Then we have Lincolnville. So you saw a photo of James Desmond earlier. This is his community. Starting in 1974, the municipality placed a first-generation landfill in the community. And ever since then, the community would say that increasing rates of cancer, different types of respiratory illness is due to this landfill. The community resisted. They engaged in civil disobedience and marches, etc. And when I met with James Desmond for the first time back in 2013, he showed me a letter that he had sent to the municipality over a year ago, asking them to redirect the landfill. He never got a response. In 2006, it was a bit of a slap in the face when a second-generation landfill was put on top of the first-generation landfill by the municipality. So at this point, I think the community kind of gave up hope that anything would be done. What they wanted was this landfill to be redirected, and the landfill, both landfills are still there today. Then we have Shelburne, South Shelburne, Nova Scotia. What you're seeing here is the dump. This might be the first case of environmental racism in Canada, I'm not sure, but the dump was placed there in 1942. And the community would say everything and anything went into this dump, including syringes and other material from the hospital, items from the military base, dead animals, and other things went into this dump. And the community once again would say increasing rates of cancer since 1942 have impacted their community. Most notably multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer. Then we have Toronto. And I need to add Hamilton to that. Hamilton is considered to be Canada's industrial town. Numerous articles have come out about Hamilton, about poor air quality and air pollution. Toronto has that issue as well. And the communities that tend to be most impacted by air pollution in both Toronto and Hamilton are racialized and immigrant, because Toronto and Hamilton are becoming increasingly racialized and immigrant. In Toronto, most notably, areas like Scarborough and North Etobicoke are hit hard by poor air pollution. So I've talked a little bit about health, but there is a term that we use to refer to the greater burdens that communities that are living near to environmental burdens experience. And this is called environmental health inequities. And in Canada, over the past probably 30 years, the literature provides strong evidence by, Canadian researchers that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities in Canada are exposed to greater health burdens and health risks compared to white communities, because they are more likely to be clustered around waste disposal sites and other environmental hazards. And I would say that one of the key people in this area of environmental health inequities is Dr. Masuda, and he is currently at the University of Victoria. We need to put gender into the mix. When we think of environmental racism, we talk about race, we talk about class, we talk about income, because when those factors intersect, you're more likely to be burdened by environmental hazards. But gender is also important. Why is gender important? Because we have to look at the body, right? We have to look at who's impacted and how they're impacted. And certainly there are gendered pathways through which pollutants expose the body to illness. So when I think specifically about Indigenous women in Amjinwang First Nation, I mentioned earlier that Amjinwang is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities. And I also mentioned earlier that they're impacted physically by many illnesses, including cancer, but reproductive cancers, birth anomalies, gestational issues, out of whack birth rate ratios. Then we have to think about the fact that environmental racism is a gendered issue when we look at the impact, the physical impact on the body, and illness that has a specific impact on women, and in this case, Indigenous women. So I formed an organization called the Enrich Project back in 2012 when I was in Nova Scotia. It's the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project. And this project has turned out to be, very multimedia, multi-approach, multidisciplinary, intersectional. I didn't see it back then. I didn't know what it would become, but that's what it's become. And I'm going to share with you some of the multimedia, multi-approach, multidisciplinary approaches I have used since 2012 to address and give attention to environmental racism. One of the things I knew I needed to do was to raise awareness, because in Nova Scotia back in 2012, people didn't understand, a lot of people didn't understand what environmental racism was. And I got a lot of questions about it. I got a lot of skepticism about it. I remember reading an article that was on me. I was featured in an article in the Chronicle Herald. And at that time, I think they were printing comments from community members, and somebody said, is Dr. Waldron serious? What is she going to come up with next? Environmental sexism? It was very tongue-in-cheek and very sarcastic. I thought it was funny, actually. I wasn't offended, but I realized that I needed to do more awareness raising, because people didn't understand the structural underpinnings of environmental racism, that it was a form of structural inequity. So when we talk about racism in employment, and racism in labor, and racism in the healthcare system, it's rooted in policy, as I said earlier, and that's structural. So I knew I needed to get out there and and organize events. And boy, did I organize numerous events every year in Nova Scotia. I can't do that anymore. I don't have the time, but I thought it was important at that time to raise awareness, because when you raise awareness, you create empathy. And then when you create empathy amongst people, then they're more likely to act. So I organized numerous events. This is one that I really liked. This is my favorite event on the screen. This was at the Central Library in Halifax. And what you see is Lenore Zan standing and speaking. You've got Lynn Jones, a Nova Scotian activist. You've got Mary Desmond from Lincolnville. You've got Doreen Bernard in the brown, all the way to the right of my screen from Sabaganagani First Nation. So this was a very interesting event that I thought was kind of inspirational and really garnered me a lot of volunteers, as I was approached by different people saying, I didn't know this was happening in Nova Scotia. I can't believe this is happening in my backyard. Can you tell me how I can help? And that's what I wanted. I wanted people to kind of reach out to me and support the work that I was doing. And they did that in Nova Scotia in droves, I would say, because I took the time to organize all these events and share my work on environmental racism, but it's also how I articulated the issue, because the term environmental racism, I understand, is a strange term. The first thing that comes to people's mind would be, how could the environment be racist? People are racist, but how can the environment be racist? So spending the time during these events to talk about environmental racism as a structural inequity and as a structural determinant of health was really important. I've also engaged in multimedia because I realize that people want to engage with a topic in different ways. Not everybody wants to read a book or a journal article, right? So being very creative is one of the ways that I wanted to share the information about environmental racism to diverse audiences. And one of the most important ways I did that was through my collaboration with Elliot Page, who began following me on Twitter in 2018. It's a long story. I will not go into it, but after that, I ended up loving Twitter just because of this. Not so much anymore, but yeah, he found me on Twitter. And in the end, we decided to do a documentary film that was then screened and premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in September of 2019. And then we heard that it might go to Netflix. And it did. In just a few weeks after COVID hit in 2020, on March 29th, 2020, it started streaming on Netflix. It started streaming on Apple TV, Microsoft Xbox, and Amazon Prime. So for me, as a professor, to have a documentary go to TIFF and then have it go to Netflix based on my very first book on environmental racism was exciting. And even to this day, I'm a bit surprised by what unraveled. That I had a film on Netflix, all these streaming platforms, and it was based on my very, very first book. But more than that, it's about awareness raising. I mean, this to me is supreme awareness raising, because the Toronto International Film Festival is global and Netflix is global. So I'm getting the information about environmental racism out there to the broadest audience possible. So I'm somebody who engages with media. Not every professor likes to engage with media, but I do, because I think there are still so many people who don't know what environmental racism is that I have to continue to talk about it. So I engage with podcasts and radio and newspapers. It's something that I enjoy doing, but I know it's also important for me to do so that more and more people learn about these issues. Of course, as a researcher, I have to do research. I've done many research projects. Right now, we're finishing up a very multidisciplinary research project in South Shelburne in 2023, which you see right here. We held a town hall in Shelburne to share what we were going to do with a new project, new study on Shelburne, to look at why there are such high cancer rates in that community. The focus groups and interviews have been completed, and we have a report on those but we're waiting for DNA samples to come in because we took blood from the community. What we're trying to find out is what's causing the high rates of cancer in Shelburne. Is it the dump? Is it African ancestry and genetics? Is it the structural determinants of health? Or is it lifestyle factors? So we're looking at those 4 issues to find out what's contributing to the high rates of cancer. Of course, I have to publish, and this is my very, very first book upon which the Netflix documentary is based. There's Something in the Water. And chapter 5 focuses on health. As a health researcher myself, that was probably, the most important or exciting chapter for me writing this book. I also want to build capacity in communities. I don't want to be a professor who goes to communities and just takes from them. That's why community members are often very cautious about professors. I feel they're skeptical, they're suspicious because they think we just want to come and take. And that's something that I'm committed to not doing. I want to build capacity. I want to build skills. I want to hone people's skills. And one of the many ways in which I've done that is through water testing. In 2017, I co-founded a organization that tests water in rural Nova Scotian communities. The organization is called Rural Water Watch. And we don't just focus on Black or Indigenous communities, we focus on all rural communities in Nova Scotia. We test their water at no cost. We train community members on how to test their own water. And we also train students, specifically environmental science students, to lead water testing projects. So till this day, this organization makes me very proud because it's something tangible that we're giving back to community. Of course, as researchers, we have to do research. I have to publish. That's my job. Research to me is very important. Providing data is very important. Policymakers respond to data. But I'm very proud of Rural Water Watch because we are giving something back, something tangible back to community members. Only recently have I gotten into climate change. The time that I was focusing on environmental racism, I didn't really want to get into the climate change space because I didn't feel that I had the necessary background. But then I encountered the climate justice framework. David Suzuki was coming to Halifax in 2019 to do a talk, and the organizers invited me to deliver a talk. And I was like confused because I was like, why are they asking me to deliver a talk? I've done environmental racism work, but environmental racism is different from climate change, and I don't know anything about climate change. But I thought I needed to kind of rise to the challenge. So I went on Google and to look for information about climate change. I also didn't want to make a fool of myself in front of David Suzuki. So I then encountered the climate justice framework, and I said to myself, this really operates similarly to environmental racism. The same communities that are impacted by pollutants and contaminants are the very same communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. And now I would say that most of my work focuses on climate change and not environmental racism. I'm really enjoying this topic. I feel that I found a really effective way to share knowledge about climate change through a climate justice lens and to engage in partnerships with policymakers at the City of Hamilton, at the City of Toronto in my work through this climate justice framework that they haven't really yet engaged in, so I'm bringing something kind of fresh and new to these climate policymakers. So yeah, this is work that I'm very engaged in now, surprisingly, and that I'm really enjoying. Education and training has been important, I would say, since Nova Scotia, when I was teaching at Dalhousie, students were so engaged in my work on environmental racism. And I remember getting students from all the disciplines that you can imagine at Dalhousie interested in environmental racism. So through my work, I continue to mentor and train young people and students on issues related to environmental racism and climate change. I just want to talk about the bill, something I'm also very excited about. So back in 2015, in Nova Scotia, I paired up with former politician Lenore Zan, and she was an NDP MLA at the time. And I wanted to engage her in a discussion on environmental racism. We met for coffee. I don't know if it's still there, but at the Starbucks on Barrington Street. And I wasn't expecting anything from this meeting. I just wanted to know if she could help. And then when we were talking, she said, well, why don't we develop a private members bill? And I said, what's that? She said, well, I want to caution you, Ingrid, these bills never turn into law, but it can give attention to the topic of environmental racism. And I'm happy to organize a press conference right after I introduce it in the Nova Scotia legislature. And I thought, wow, I said to her, yeah, that's great. It's disappointing that it's not going to turn into law, but the fact that it can give more attention to this topic and that we can hold a press conference sounds great to me. And that happened. We co-developed this private members bill. She introduced it in the Nova Scotia legislature on April 29th, 2015. November 25th that year, it went to second reading, but it never went any further. So just a few weeks before COVID hit, she came to me in 2020 and she said, Ingrid, remember that bill that we developed? And I said, yes. She said, well, why don't we turn it into a federal private members bill? And I thought, this is a great idea. We can address environmental racism across the country and not simply confine it to Nova Scotia, because I was quite aware that there were many Indigenous communities across Canada that were dealing with pipelines. So we took that Nova Scotia private members bill and we turned it into a stronger bill, a much more robust bill, being much more specific. And Lenore then introduced it in the House of Commons in 2020, February 26. It went to second reading. It started to go through the Parliament quite nicely. And then, as you remember, in fall of 2021, there was a snap election called by Trudeau. And when that happens, all private members' bills get wiped off the table. Our bill was dead. So I said to Lenore, what happens now? We spent so many years trying to get this done. And she said, well, I'm hearing something about Elizabeth May wanting to take on the bill. And we had a three-way call on Zoom with Elizabeth May and Lenore and myself. And Elizabeth needed to be convinced a bit because she had another bill that she wanted to introduce. She said, Ingrid, if you support me, I'm happy to take on this bill. And I said, I'm definitely going to support you. I will do some campaigns online and I'm going to do whatever you'd like. I would like you to spearhead or sponsor this bill. And she agreed to do that. In February 2nd, 2022, she reintroduced the bill in the House of Commons in Parliament. And just as with Lenore Zan, it moved nicely through Parliament. But unlike with Lenore Zan, we saw that the bill went to Senate first reading. And I thought to myself, the bill has a chance. I can't believe it. So it went to first reading at Senate. I think that was in 2023. And then in June, on June 13th, 2020, it passed third reading at Senate. And then on June 20th last year, it was given royal assent in the Senate and became Canada's very first environmental justice legislation. So I am so excited that I had a part in developing this bill. A central aspect of this, well, it's a law now, it's a Canadian law now, Canadian legislation. A central aspect of it is the National Environmental Justice Strategy, which is a policy that is discussed in the bill, which the Federal Department of Environment is leading to do consultations across the country with communities that are impacted by environmental racism. That's going on right now. Consultations, a study, a mapping project, and then those consultations end next year, and the government will need to report back about what they found. So yeah, I'm leaving you on a bit of a high note that we now have in Canada the first environmental justice law. I'm not even sure if they have that in the United States, but this is certainly a groundbreaking legislation, of course. I want to leave you, though, as social workers, with a few things that I think social workers need to think about or to contribute to in helping to address environmental racism. And it's not dissimilar from what I've done. I always say to students and other people, you can do what I did. I know that I have privilege as a professor and that certain people will talk to me because I'm a professor, etc. So I recognize my privilege and I recognize that people without my privilege may not be able to do some of the things that I've done because I'm allowed into particular spaces. But I do believe that where there's a will, there's a way, and social workers and other health professionals can do much of what I have done. So first thing I would say, advocate for the importance of schools of social work embedding issues of social and environmental determinants of health into their curricula. This is big. I would say that schools of medicine, schools of nursing, schools of social work, unless I'm wrong, like Dalhousie, need to focus more on environmental racism. There's a siloing of environmental racism, I feel. So people who are in environmental science, they focus on environmental racism, but they often don't focus on health. And then I would say maybe social work, unless I'm wrong, will focus on health issues, but they don't really discuss environmental racism as a health issue. And as you heard today, it is a health issue. So we should not be excluding it in the curricula. So you need to advocate to your professors, to the schools of social work at Dalhousie, to administrators, that you need to see environmental racism embedded into your curriculum as a health issue. The other thing I would say for social workers, get involved in community advocacy around environmental racism. Anyone can do this. You can write letters and op-eds to local newspapers as health professionals. Social workers are seen as community advocates, as health experts. Share your wisdom in these op-eds about the health impacts, the health issues linked to environmental racism. So you can serve as social workers, you can serve as credible sources of information as well at community events, community gatherings, community organizations, committees, professional forums, right? That's something that's really key. Many of you are on committees, you're on boards, maybe related to health, maybe related to poverty, maybe related to the social determinants of health. Those issues, poverty, social determinants of health, have links to environmental racism. So make your voices heard as credible sources of information. Participate on boards and committees at organizations that focus on environmental racism, and bring your expertise as social workers, as community advocates, as experts on health. Support environmental justice campaigns launched by ENGOs, or launch your own campaigns. So it's easy. If you go onto the David Suzuki Foundation website, or the website for environmental defense, or the website for the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, they often tell you step by step how you can support a cleaner environment. They give you the step-by-step approaches. You don't even have to think. So if you want to know how you can help, even small steps that you take are big steps. You don't have to do anything grand. It could be small things, but they're very effective. So get on to some of the major environmental organizations in Canada, and they will spell out how you can help. Tyler asked me to just say briefly what gives me hope. So I would say my work on environmental racism, what has given me hope most, has been the young people who have been on the front lines of environmental justice and climate justice organizing. Many of those young people I met in Nova Scotia. I feel in Nova Scotia, they're very present. I was able to find, I would say, my people, my environmental activists, the young people, very quickly, maybe because Nova Scotia is smaller, but when I went there, it didn't take long to find the group of people that understood what I was doing. And those people were young people in their 20s and 30s. And I respect them because they're relentless. They don't give up. I often say that this is an issue where we're dealing with, 5 steps forward, 10 steps backwards. It's I think the young people often feel burnt out, but then they get themselves back up again and they keep going. So I don't really have environmental justice heroes that are I guess what we would call celebrities. I do respect and I really do like Greta, I forgot her last name, the young Swedish woman, Greta. I do respect her. But I would say in general, I just respect the young people that I've met over the years who are relentless, who are stubborn, who never give up on these issues. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And it's an incredibly complex and complicated area of work, and I can see that you're doing so much. And so as you were chatting, I was posting in some of the links to the organizations and the movements that you've been connected to. So folks in the chat, look, you can see some more about There's Something in the Water, the film. There's a Canopy link there. Learn more about the Rural Water Initiative. There's also some links in there about the Enrich project as well, including the film that Ingrid mentioned earlier on. So there's lots of links in there to engage with. I'm also going to post some other links here in the chat because we are going to transition into small group discussions to make sense and debrief and unpack some of the things that we've heard today. But the first link is the link to the Canva chat, or the Canva presentation, pardon me. So this is where you're going to be able to see the prompts. So once we go into small group discussions, you'll lose the prompts on my screen, but you'll have access to them there. And also the evaluation survey link. I always appreciate when people fill out the evaluation survey. I also recognize that some people might have to leave at 1 o'clock. I'm seeing some people in the chat understanding that this is a lunch break for many folks. So if you have to go, completely understand. I'll share my screen here for a second. So we're going to go into some small group discussions. And what's going to happen is when I create the breakout rooms, you're going to be about 2 to 3 people, 3 to 4 people per breakout room. You're going to get a pop-up window, whether you're on a laptop or an iPad or on a phone. You should see something that indicates you've been invited to a Zoom room or a breakout room, and you have to accept that invitation. So it's going to look something like this, depending on the platform that you're on. But in the small group discussions, we'll go for about 15 minutes. I want you to make sure that you introduce yourselves, build relationships, and get to know each other. All the work that we're doing to advance social justice is dependent upon relationships. So be sure to spend time doing that. Some questions you might want to explore based on the conversations that we're having today. Given what you've learned about environmental racism, what is the role of social workers to address this issue of environmental racism across the micro, meso, and macro systems? How might social workers activate critical hope for better futures through taking action on environmental racism? I also want to highlight that in our mini conference this Friday on activating hope and building connections, we'll be talking about some advocacy guidelines and toolkits that social workers can use to do some of the work that Ingrid's been doing by influencing MLAs and MPs and political systems, but also trying to advance social justice in many different areas of life. So if you're coming to the conference on Friday, we'll have some resources for you around this as well. Yeah, please click on the link in the chat to make sure you have access to these prompts. But reminder, it's about, pardon me, it's about relationships. And so if you're in a small group and you don't want to talk about these things because another conversation feels more important at the time, have that conversation. But these prompts are available if you'd like to have them. So we have about 16 people. So I'm going to do 5 breakout rooms. And Ingrid, do you want to be put in one?
I actually have to leave for another meeting.
Oh, perfect. That's totally understandable. I'm so grateful for you to be here. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to connecting. And a small part of me is probably going to reach out to you about PhDs at one point. So.
Oh, yes. Okay. That'd be great. I give a lot of advice on that, so I like it. Yeah.
Good. I look forward to it. But have a great day, and I hope you have things to look forward to.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
So we have about 11 people. And given that we only have 11 people, I'm wondering, perhaps maybe we just have a discussion in this space. I'm going to pause recording. So I just want to point to our active hope spiral. So we've had some really enriching conversations around the roles of social workers in addressing the climate emergency and environmental racism. And I just want to draw us back to what kind of originated this series of Active Hope. And it was really the work of Joanna Macy around Active Hope. And this is referencing that work and the Active Hope spiral. And I see these as a way of reflecting and having maybe a chance to think critically about how we can generate hope in ourselves. So these prompts could be useful for you. So folks in this call or people watching the recording later on, what is it that you love? I love blank. And again, a reminder, this is tap into a sense of hope. I'd like to thank blank. Looking at the future, my concerns are facing these concerns. What inspires me is what I hope for in the future is a part I'd like to play is a step I'll take during the next week is. So thinking a little bit critically about, generally what we love and appreciate, but also drilling that down into something tangible that we can do today or tomorrow or next week, something to point towards the future and take some sort of active, hopeful positions or energy around this work. I want to point to some upcoming events. So we're almost at time, but we do have our mini conference this Friday on building connections and activating hope. And so for folks who are on this call, we will be exploring that concept of critical hope through our panel discussions and also through an activity in the afternoon. We also are continuing our closed group spaces for people of African Nova Scotia, or people who are African Nova Scotian or of African descent, community of practice. That's on May 22nd. That'll be facilitated by Bria Simons, our associate registrar. We'll be doing a lunch and learn on ethical marketing for clinical specialists with Samantha Sardi, May 23rd. We're having a closed group space, community of practice for 2S LGBTQI plus and queer social workers. And then on May 26th and 30th, we're going to be hosting 2 feedback focus groups around our professional development program. So if you've attended any of our professional development programs and you want to contribute to the future design of other activities or the program in general, please come to that. Really appreciate it. That is it for today's session. I'm really grateful that Dr. Waldron was with us today and was able to share some of her insights and expertise. Super grateful for all of you folks for attending. I'll stick on for a little bit if you have any questions or things that you want to talk about, but otherwise, thank you so much for attending.